Suzanne Summers fought hard to be taken seriously after Three's company, a contract dispute that cost her the show, but never her drive. Burt Bacharach spent years at the piano, proving that pop music could carry real emotional weight. Anne Heche made a choice in 1997 that Hollywood said would end her, and she kept working anyway. Shannon Doherty faced the kind of reputation that follows a person from set to set, and she outlasted most of the gossip. David McCallum reinvented himself so completely across 7 decades that each generation got to discover him all over again. Sidney Poitier walked into rooms where he was not expected to belong, and he changed what those rooms looked like forever. These were people who hit a wall, made a call, and kept going. In 1991, Samuel L. Jackson walked into an audition for Jungle Fever, not as a star, not as a known quantity, but as a man who had just spent time in a rehabilitation facility after a serious crack cocaine addiction that had nearly erased everything he had quietly been building for years. Spike Lee knew Jackson. He had used him in small roles before. But this time, Lee did something almost nobody in Hollywood does. He held the role of Gator Purify open, waiting, specifically asking that Jackson be considered once he was out of treatment. What happened next was not guaranteed. It could have gone the other way. A director with a tight schedule, a studio with cold feet, or one more relapse. Any of those things, and the name Samuel L. Jackson might have remained a footnote in 1990s independent film, rather than one of the most recognizable presences in cinema history. He won the Cannes Film Festival's Best Supporting Actor prize for that performance. It was the first time that award had ever been given. The jury invented the category because they felt they had no other choice. Think about what that means. Not a nomination, not a consolation credit. A prize that did not exist before Samuel L. Jackson made it necessary. But to understand why that moment was so fragile and why the path there was so improbable, you have to go back much further. To a young man in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who grew up in the segregated South, raised almost entirely by his mother and grandparents, with a father who was largely absent from his life. Elizabeth Jackson raised her son with structure and expectation in a household where education was not optional. He was a serious student, gifted enough, but not the kind of kid anyone would have circled in a yearbook and predicted for global fame. He arrived at Morehouse College in Atlanta in the late 1960s, and the world was on fire. The civil rights movement was not history yet. It was happening in the streets outside the campus gates. Jackson was not a passive observer. He became politically active, and in 1969 he was part of a group of students who held members of the Morehouse Board of Trustees hostage during a protest demanding curriculum reform and more black representation in the school's leadership. Martin Luther King Sr. was among those held. Jackson was suspended. His mother, furious, pulled his funding. He was forced to reckon with what he actually wanted. He switched his major to drama, not because the path was clear, but because nothing else felt true. That pivot, born from a moment of disciplinary consequence, turned out to be the hinge everything else rotated around. He moved to Atlanta's theater community, building craft in relative obscurity. He met his wife, LaTanya Richardson, at Morehouse. She would become one of the most consistent presences in his life. An actor herself, someone who later said publicly that she was the one who called Spike Lee and told him Samuel needed help during the addiction years. That call was not a small thing. It may have saved his career, and by some accounts, more than that. Jackson arrived in New York in the 1970s, grinding through the theater world, taking small film parts, doing television work that paid, but did not define him. He appeared in small roles in films like Ragtime and Eddie Murphy's Coming to America. He was present in the industry, but not yet of it in any starring sense. He was working. He was watching. And at some point in the late 1980s, the crack cocaine that had circulated widely through New York's social and artistic worlds caught up with him in a serious way. His wife and daughter came home one day to find him unconscious on the kitchen floor. That was the intervention point. Latanya Richardson and his daughter Zoe confronted him directly, and he entered rehabilitation. The specifics of his treatment have been discussed by Jackson himself in multiple interviews over the years. He has never hidden it, and he has never dressed it up. He has said plainly that the addiction was destructive and that getting clean was not a spiritual awakening as much as it was a decision rooted in not wanting to lose his family. He came out of treatment, and Spike Lee was waiting. Jungle Fever opened in 1991. Jackson played Gator Purify, the crack-addicted brother of Wesley Snipes' character, a role that required him to inhabit, with complete honesty, a version of what he had just escaped. The performance is uncomfortable to watch in the best possible sense. There is nothing performative about it. Critics noticed immediately. The Cannes Prize was not just recognition. It was the industry saying loudly that something new had arrived. What came next was swift in retrospect, but not without its own crossroads. Quentin Tarantino had seen Jackson in a small part in Goodfellas and wanted him for Pulp Fiction. The original casting for Jules Winfield was not Jackson. It was Paul Calderon, who had read for the role and whom the producers were leaning toward. Jackson flew in from New York, auditioned, and the part shifted. Tarantino and producer Lawrence Bender made the call. Calderon ended up with a smaller role in the film instead. Pulp Fiction opened at Cannes in 1994 and won the Palme d'Or. Jackson's Jules, philosophical, violent, quoting a corrupted version of a biblical passage, threatening in one moment and strangely poetic in the next, became one of the defining screen performances of the decade. The speech that closes his most famous scene in that film has been analyzed, quoted, and referenced so extensively that it has effectively left the movie and entered the cultural language on its own terms. Jackson himself has noted in interviews that he still gets asked to recite it more than almost anything else he has ever done. The decade that followed was a demonstration of range applied at volume. He did not retreat into prestige films and careful choices. He said yes broadly, appeared in studio blockbusters and smaller independent work almost interchangeably, and developed a reputation as one of the most reliable and hard-working actors in the industry. Alongside the work that won critical attention, A Time to Kill, Jackie Brown, with Tarantino again, he took on franchise material and action films that others might have considered beneath a serious actor's dignity. He never seemed to share that concern. There is a documented moment in the mid-1990s around the production of Die Hard with a Vengeance that speaks to how Jackson operated in this period. He had made clear that he was not interested in performing a particular racial dynamic that the original script contained. Specifically, the use of a racist slur displayed on a sign his character would carry. The story, which has been reported in multiple outlets and confirmed in Jackson's own retellings, is that he pushed back, that the scene was reworked, and that he proceeded. He was not walking off pictures, he was negotiating the terms on which he would show up. That distinction matters. The Marvel chapter of his career began in a post-credits scene at the end of Iron Man in 2008, where he appeared as Nick Fury, a cameo that announced not just a character, but the architecture of a shared cinematic universe. It was a franchise commitment on a scale the industry had not quite seen before in terms of contractual scope. Jackson signed on for what was reported as a 9-picture deal. He has appeared in more than that. Nick Fury became something like a structural element of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the figure who moves between stories, who connects threads, who arrives when the stakes are highest. What is notable about that chapter is not just its commercial scale, but what it demonstrates about Jackson's relationship to longevity. He was in his late 50s when it began. Most actors are negotiating a narrowing of roles at that point. Jackson was signing into what became one of the most commercially successful film franchises in history. He received an Academy Honorary Award in 2022, the Governor's Award, which the Academy presents for extraordinary distinction in lifetime achievement. Jackson had been nominated once before for Pulp Fiction and had not won. When the honorary award was announced, there was a layer of industry acknowledgement that the competitive nomination had not resulted in the recognition the performance warranted. Jackson's public response was characteristically direct. He expressed gratitude, but he also noted that he was still working, still making films, and that the honorary framing did not close anything. That framing, the honorary award as a kind of closing statement, was something Jackson appeared to consciously resist. He has continued to be publicly visible, outspoken on political and social issues, and professionally active. He campaigned visibly in recent election cycles, has spoken about race and justice in terms that are direct and unsentimental, and has not adopted the posture of a figure in graceful retirement. The Addiction Story, the Cannes Prize, Pulp Fiction, the Marvel Decade, none of these things were inevitable. Each one required something to go right that could have gone wrong. Spike Lee could have cast someone else. Tarantino could have gone with his first choice. The rehabilitation could have failed. Any earlier departure from the industry during the addiction years could have made him simply unavailable when the defining moments arrived. What the record shows is a man who was present for decades, doing the work, building the instrument, losing control of his life, getting it back, and then being in exactly the right place when the industry finally turned its full attention toward him. He was 42 years old when Jungle Fever came out. He was 46 when Pulp Fiction arrived. That timeline is not an accident. It is a consequence of years of craft accumulated before the spotlight found him. Samuel L. Jackson has appeared in more than 150 films. That number is cited often, usually as a symbol of prolificacy. What it actually represents is a consistency of purpose across 6 decades, a willingness to keep showing up, to keep working, to treat the job as the point, rather than as a vehicle for something else. The story is not finished. The turning point in 1991 opened a door. What he did with what was behind it is still being written.